Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Communications Director for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our entire staff, our President and CEO, Mark Mellman, our board of co-chairs, Todd Richmond and Ann Lewis, whom I know are on with us today, welcome. We're so happy to have you here, especially during this difficult time. We hope you and your loved ones are safe and stay well and healthy. I'm going to hand it over to Mark Mellman in just a minute, but first I want to go over a few items. If you have any questions, we will have a Q&A portion of the discussion today. You can submit them through your Zoom feature in the Q&A box. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can submit questions through the comments box on Facebook Live. Finally, before I hand it over to Mark, please, if you like what you hear today, if you'd like to learn more about Democratic Majority for Israel, you can find us on Facebook. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can sign up for our news and updates at dmfi.org. Thanks so much. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mark Mellman.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thanks so much, all of you, for being here. Thanks so much to Tony for being with us. Todd, our co-chairman, Todd Richmond, requires that I apologize in each and every one of these sessions for the incredible view of my nasal passages. This is a well-known flaw of Dell computers that mattered not a whit to me 2 months ago, but today seems to be extremely important. So forgive me for that. But it's really my pleasure to introduce Tony Blinken to you all. Tony has played a key role in formulating and implementing American foreign policy for over 30 years. And he's done it from Capitol Hill, he's done it from the White House, and from the State Department. His work has encompassed every region in the world and all the full range of issues that are confronting the United States in dealing with the rest of the world. Tony served as the Democratic Staff Director at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when a senator named Joe Biden was the chairman and ranking member of that committee. He served in top roles on the White House National Security Council staff in the Clinton and Obama administrations. He was the National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden when he was Vice President, and then Deputy Secretary of State at the State Department, the nation's #2 diplomat. In those roles, he's helped to lead diplomacy in the fight against ISIS, to rebalance to Asia, the global refugee crisis, and building bridges to the innovation community. In the private sector, Tony was the co-founder and managing partner at West Exec Advisors. He's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and a global affairs analyst for CNN. He authored a book called Ally versus Ally, America, Europe, and the Siberian Pipeline Crisis. He's a graduate of Harvard College and of Columbia Law School, which, in a personal note, I would say my son would have been graduating today along with Vice President Biden's granddaughter, where graduation's still a thing. So again, Tony, we're so grateful to have you with us. Look forward to your remarks.
Mark, thank you so much. And to all of you, Rachel, Todd, Ann, always great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me today. And first of all, Mark, thank you very much for referencing my book, Ally versus Ally, America, Europe, and the Siberian Pipeline Crisis, which is still available on Amazon if you go take a look. I should warn you that one reviewer said that it's the kind of book that once put down is very hard to pick up again. But with that warning, please go ahead and take a look. It's buried there at probably around 75,000 or so in popularity. In all seriousness, though, I really want to start by saying to all of you, I just hope that you and yours are well and safe in these incredibly trying times. That's my most fervent wish for everyone on this call and all of your families. So this morning, before we got started, I went by the DFMI offices and I looked in your mailbox and I found a letter in the mailbox, which I will read to you if you'll allow me to, and I'm putting on my glasses to do it. And it reads, it's addressed to Democratic Majority for Israel, and it says, "Dear friends, I am grateful for and humbled by your statement of support for this campaign and my candidacy for president. It fills me with pride to have the endorsement of so many incredible communities whose efforts to secure a brighter future and a more just society inspire me to keep fighting. I'm honored to have earned the early support of the Democratic Majority for Israel, and your continued engagement will be vital as we build toward the general election. DMFI has been a powerful voice standing up for our party's principles and advocating for a strong, enduring partnership between Israel and the United States, grounded in our democratic values. That's been my firm conviction since my first visit to Israel in 1973. and I look forward to continuing to strengthen the partnership between our nations as president, including by working toward a two-state solution that results in a secure, democratic, and Jewish state of Israel living side by side in peace with a Palestinian state. You know, as I do, just how much promise our country has and the importance of not taking a single vote for granted. That's the kind of campaign we're running, and I'm proud to stand side by side with you in the battle for the soul of this great nation. Thanks again for your support and for your service to our country. We're lucky to have your voice and your leadership. Sincerely, Joe Biden. So that's what's in the mailbox today, and I wanted to start by extending those greetings from Vice President Biden. You all know him very well for many years. His time in the Senate, his time as Vice President, and equally, he knows Israel and the relationship between our countries, I would say, arguably better than anyone in American public life. As you've heard him talk about, his very first trip as a new United States Senator, his first foreign trip, was to Israel in 1973, just before the Yom Kippur War. And probably each of you have heard him tell this story, just a few times. But you'll remember that Golda Meir was prime minister then. He had the great honor of meeting with her and a young aide by her side by the name of Yitzhak Rabin. And as he tells the story, he was very concerned because you could feel the storm clouds coming in advance of the Yom Kippur War. And Prime Minister Meir looked at him and said, "You seem very concerned, Senator." And he said, "I am. I'm concerned for your security." And she grabbed him by the shoulder and said, "It's all right. We have a secret weapon." And of course, he was wondering what that secret weapon might be. And she paused and said, "Our secret weapon is we have no place else to go." That encounter, that first trip, deep-rooted in Joe Biden, very, very strong commitments to Israel's security and to its future. He's been a collaborator, a partner, an engager with every prime minister since Prime Minister Meir, and he's been engaged in every issue affecting Israel since that time, with a commitment to Israel's security as the foundation for his engagement, and a commitment to the partnership between Israel and the United States as the foundation for his commitment. I think it's worth spending just a minute on some of the work of the Obama-Biden administration when it comes to Israel's security and the partnership between the United States and Israel. It's something that is too often ignored or discounted, because the simple fact is no administration has done more for Israel's security than the Obama-Biden administration. If you look at the ties between our militaries, the ties between our intelligence communities, the pace and depth of the work they were doing together, the exchanges they had, there was certainly no time when those were deeper and more constant. Iron Dome is much talked about. Well, that commitment was huge and dramatic. $1 billion, not just Iron Dome, though, other critical defensive systems for Israel, including David Sling, Arrow 3. Iron Dome resonates particularly with me because in the midst of the Gaza conflict in the summer, I was sitting in my office. I was then the Deputy National Security Advisor. And I got a call relatively late in the evening from Ron Dermer, the ambassador. And Ron said, "Could I come over now to talk to you about an urgent matter?" I said, "Of course." And so Ron came over to the White House. It was late on a Thursday evening, and he brought with him the military attaché. And they explained to me in great detail, with very impressive charts, the urgent need for replenishment of the Iron Dome system. Some of the interceptors were running low, and they needed this urgently. The very next morning, Friday, I went into the Oval Office for the daily meeting with the president and the vice president on national security issues. And I recounted what Ambassador Dermer and the military attaché had told me. And President Obama and Vice President Biden looked at me and said simply, "Get it done." Well, we went to Congress that weekend, and by early the next week, we had an additional $250 million for Israel and for Iron Dome replenishment. That's the kind of response that the administration gave when it came to Israel's security. You all know very well as well the unprecedented memorandum of understanding, $38 billion over 10 years, the largest military aid package in the history of the United States. And of course, beyond this cooperation, military to military, intelligence community to intelligence community, defensive systems, there were other profoundly important actions that the Vice President directly took part in, including fighting efforts to delegitimize Israel at the United Nations and its agencies, fighting against the BDS movement, standing up constantly for Israel's legitimacy whenever it was challenged. There are other things too that were not noticed, but were vitally important, including helping to increase scientific and technological cooperation and collaboration with the world's greatest startup nation. And of course, a deep, enduring commitment to doing what we could to advance a two-state solution, because that solution is the single best way, and maybe the only way, to guarantee Israel's future as a secure, Jewish, and democratic state, as well as to meet the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. In a Biden administration, just a few things I wanted to touch on. First, as president, Joe Biden would sustain and deepen the military and intelligence cooperation between our countries, ensure Israel's qualitative military edge. He would work to try to re-energize and then ultimately advance the prospect of two states, urging both sides to refrain from unilateral actions that undermine the prospect of getting back on a track toward two states. He would resume support for the Palestinian Authority, reopening the US consulate in East Jerusalem, restoring economic security and humanitarian assistance, but consistent with the Taylor Force Act that many of you are aware of, that withholds certain humanitarian and security assistance to the PA unless measures are taken to end acts of violence against Israel and Israeli and US citizens, including terminating payments to individuals engaged in acts of terror. He would insist that the Palestinian Authority stop incitement, and most profoundly, recognize once and for all the right and reality of a Jewish state in Israel. The Biden administration would continue to reject the BDS efforts. It would reverse efforts to make Israel a political football, something we can come back to, which is profoundly damaging to Israel as well, I believe, as to the United States. He would work to expand even further collaboration in a whole host of areas, including especially science and technology. And maybe that's no more important now as we're all striving to find an answer to the COVID-19 crisis. These are just some of the ways that a Biden administration would strongly advance our cooperation, our collaboration, our work with Israel. Let me just say a couple of other things before we turn to questions and answers, because one of the things that's most striking to me is why Joe Biden got into this race in the first place. This has been written about, and of course he's talked about it, but it's important to remember. I was with him constantly after the administration, after the Obama-Biden administration, indeed helped him launch the Penn Biden Center that we're very, very proud of, but that of course we've had to pull back from in the wake of this campaign. And of course, I had many conversations with him about possibly running for president. And as you know, he held back for a long time. But there was one incident that sparked his determination to run. And that, of course, was Charlottesville. The idea that in this time, in this country, we could see people emerging from the forests around Charlottesville, spewing the same kind of anti-Semitic bile as we heard in the 1930s, that in and of itself was unacceptable. But then to have the sitting president of the United States talk about that in his estimation, there were good people on both sides, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for Joe Biden. And that's why he got into this race. And that's why he talks about recapturing the soul of our nation. We've seen, as you know, not just in Charlottesville, but Crown Heights, Pittsburgh, Poway, a historic increase in anti-Semitic incidents in this country. And also, I might add, incidents against other religious groups and against LGBT as well. We've also heard a lot of dog whistles and tropes, anti-Semitic tropes, coming from this White House. As the Vice President has said, silence is complicity. We have to speak out, we have to speak up, and that should start with the President of the United States. He should not be aiding and abetting those who are advancing anti-Semitism and bigotry. He should be calling them out and putting a stop to it. But it's not just talk, it's also action. Some of you may have noticed about 2 weeks ago, the Vice President put out a detailed plan to safeguard places of worship, including new security grants, faith-based law enforcement, including new tools for law enforcement, training, prosecuting hate crimes, restoring and indeed increasing funding that has been cut by this administration. That is vitally important to the Vice President and something, again, that's motivating his desire to be President of the United States. Finally, let me end with this before we get into a conversation. The values of the Jewish community in this country are the same values that are animating our campaign for the White House. Equality, dignity, tolerance. These are things that have animated Joe Biden his entire career. The fight for civil rights, for women's rights, for equal pay, the fight against the National Rifle Association. And of course, these big, huge, important muscle movements, healthcare, education, dealing with climate change. All of these resonate profoundly in our Jewish community here in the United States, and they animate the Vice President's campaign for the presidency. So let me stop there. I really welcome having a conversation, hearing comments, hearing questions, concerns, you name it, the floor is open.
Thanks so much, Tony. I'll kick it off with a question from a supporter. I think every administration of both parties has had some differences with whatever government was elected in Israel. We have two models on how to handle those disagreements, again, from both parties. One stresses quiet diplomacy and even quiet pressure. The other utilizes public chastisement and even public threats. Which approach do you think is more effective? Which approach would a Biden administration be more likely to pursue?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And I can tell you that a Biden administration, well, let me start with Joe Biden as president. Joe Biden believes strongly in keeping your differences to the greatest extent possible between friends, behind doors, having it out as necessary, but maintaining as little daylight as possible in public. You don't want to put people in a corner when it comes to your friends and partners in public. You're much more effective when you have a difference of opinion, when you disagree on a policy matter, in dealing with it in private, doing it clearly, forcefully, effectively, but not airing to the greatest extent possible any dirty laundry in public. And you know, I think one of the great strengths that a President Biden would bring to the relationship with Israel is, as I said, he goes back a long, long time with Israel. He's known, respected, and liked across the body politic in Israel. And that gives him a huge amount of credibility when it comes to engaging with our partners, including on hard questions when we might disagree, and to do it in a way that doesn't harm the relationship. I'll tell you one story. After the second Intifada, when the Vice President was in the Senate, we went to Israel and got to the King David Hotel, and many of you will remember this at the time. In the wake of the Intifada, the second Intifada, it was empty. I remember it really powerfully because we We saw the manager, many of you know her, and she was almost despondent at the lack of guests at the hotel. In fact, there was only one other person in the dining room that morning when we went down for breakfast the next morning, Dennis Ross, which won't be a surprise to many of you. But during that trip, we went to visit then Finance Minister Netanyahu. He wasn't prime minister at the time. We went to his office as finance minister, and with great glee, he pointed to a photo on his desk, and the photo was a signed photograph from Joe Biden, and it said, "Bibi, you're wrong about everything, but I love you, Joe Biden." That's the nature of the relationship, and that makes a huge difference when it comes to working closely together to get things done, to deal with any differences, to move things forward. And if Joe Biden is president, that's exactly the way he would operate.
Thanks, Tony. We're getting a lot of questions about the Iran deal, the JCPOA. So here's one from a supporter that I'm going to ask. President Trump foolishly withdrew from the Iran agreement without a plan to get a better deal. But partly because of that decision, Iran has blown through some caps and failed to take some actions it was required to take. Moreover, some key provisions sunset within a year and a half of Vice President Biden taking office. So simply rejoining the old Iran deal seems unrealistic. What would a next Iran deal look like in a Biden administration?
So, a great question. And I want to start by emphasizing the first point that you made, which is that under its own terms, President Trump's approach to Iran has been a very, very strong failure. As you noted, in pulling out of the deal, a deal that, again, under the terms of the deal, Iran was adhering to, according to our intelligence agencies, according to international inspectors. In pulling out of it, President Trump said that this would compel Iran to come forward to negotiate a quote unquote better deal. And then in exerting maximum pressure, as he called it, this would cause Iran to stop its malevolent and destabilizing activities in the region. And of course, as many of us predicted at the time, we've seen exactly the opposite. We saw a cycle of actions going back and forth between the United States and Iran. We saw and we've seen Iran restart some of the most dangerous aspects of its nuclear program that the Iran deal stopped. And of course, far from curbing and stopping its dangerous actions in the region, it's actually increased them, endangering US soldiers in the process, including particularly in Iraq, as well as in Syria. And at the same time, President Trump's actions managed to alienate us from our closest partners in Europe, and in fact, to put us on the spot instead of Iran. So on its own terms, this has been a very, very significant failure. But of course, things have happened, time has passed, and if there is going to be an Iran deal 2.0, a few things would be required. First, as the Vice President said, Iran would have to come back into full compliance with its obligations under the existing agreement. If it did that, then a Biden administration would come back into compliance as well, but we would use that as a platform to try to build a stronger and longer agreement. And I think we'd be in a much better place to do that because we could do that with the support and cooperation of our allies and partners, including in Europe, who've been alienated from us by this administration. That would have an added benefit too. These same allies and partners would be much more likely in that context to work closely with us and to coordinate and cooperate in curbing Iran's malevolent activities in other areas. Right now, that's been forfeited because of the disagreement over us pulling out of the Iran agreement. So I think we'd be in a much better position to deal with both the most acute problem to our own security, which is Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon, and also much more effective in curbing Iran's malicious activities.
Thanks, Tony. Oh, here's a question from Lisa Eisen. Many of us are concerned about how the prospect of annexation by the new Israeli government would affect the US-Israel relationship, and especially the Democratic Party's support for Israel. Can you please speak to Vice President Biden's position and the potential reverberations of such a move?
Vice President has spoken to this question a few times during the campaign already, and he's been clear in his opposition to annexation. And here's why. as I mentioned earlier, the only way to secure Israel's future as a democratic and Jewish state is through two states. And it's also the only way to meet the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. Any unilateral action by either side that makes what is already a very difficult prospect even more difficult is something he opposes. And annexation is exactly that kind of unilateral action. So that is the basis for his opposition. Of course, he is far from alone in that opposition, and not just in the United States, as many of you know very well. More than 200 leading former military and intelligence officials in Israel recently came out very clearly against pursuing annexation, and they list a whole variety of reasons for doing that, including the added security burden that would likely be imposed on Israel in the West Bank, and including the responses and reactions of neighboring countries. So for all of those reasons, the vice president's been very clear in his opposition. He's been equally clear about what he expects of the Palestinians, because they too need to curb either unilateral actions that may get in the way of somehow putting some momentum back into two states, and also into creating an atmosphere, an environment in which the pursuit of a two-state solution is once again possible. And that has to include ending incitement. It has to include ending violence. And maybe most important of all, it has to include, finally, a recognition of the reality and the right of a Jewish state in Israel. So he has real expectations going forward, but the main thing is neither side should engage in unilateral actions that make the prospect of two states even more distant than it already is.
Here's another question from a supporter. What does the U.S. get out of the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Wow, that could take a while, but thank you for asking it. First of all, and maybe most significantly, we have a democratic partner in the heart of the Middle East that, when it's living up to the better angels of its nature, is setting a profound example for what the rest of the region could and should be, as hopefully countries evolve toward greater freedom, greater openness, greater democracy. It has a strategic partner in dealing with some of the threats to our security emanating from the region, including notably from Iran. And that is absolutely critical and vital. And in many ways, it has a profound partner in thinking about and working on together some of the most challenging problems facing our countries and our peoples, and indeed humanity, as we head forward. If you think about the things that are most challenging to us, one that we're living right now, this pandemic, but also climate change, and also thinking about the technology that is dominating increasingly our lives. It's hard to think of a partnership that can matter more than the one between Israel and the United States, because we bring the same values and we bring unique capacities to tackle some of these problems, working together to meet the challenge of a pandemic, working together to deal with climate change, and maybe in a way working together, most importantly, to make sure that the technologies that increasingly dominate our lives are infused by the values we share, not by the values that some others hold that are inimical to what we believe. It's hard to think of anything more important. So across the breadth and depth of the relationship, there are so many places to drive it forward that would benefit the United States and I believe benefit Israel.
Thanks, Tony. Here's a question from Facebook Live and Cohen. How will Biden administration deal with the few on the left who are clearly both anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic? Just those who do not believe Israel has the right to exist.
So one of the things that troubles me the most, and I suspect most of you feel the same way, is the extent to which some have tried to turn Israel into a political football in our politics. We've had decades of Republican and Democratic administrations alike, making sure that support for Israel was done on a bipartisan basis, particularly support for Israel's security. And I believe profoundly that we need to keep it that way. Republican and Democratic administrations alike had worked to ensure that Israel has the means and right to defend itself, and to help pursue peace between Israel and its neighbors, including with the Palestinians. But I think we've seen two things in recent years. One, in recent campaigns and during the Obama-Biden administration, Israel was often used as a political tool to score points against Democrats. I think President Trump has taken that to a whole new level, or maybe a whole new depth, calling Democrats an anti-Israel party, for example. And it's going to get worse as we get closer to the election. That's profoundly wrong and profoundly dangerous to the relationship, bad for Israel, bad for the United States. But equally wrong are those who dismiss the daily and existential threats that Israel faces, or who don't call out the Palestinians for the very bad choices that they make, the failure to recognize the right reality of the Jewish state. There is, of course, room for legitimate criticism of some Israeli policies, but that does not define the relationship. And too often that slides into anti-Semitism. So we need to call that out as well. Our party, the Democratic Party, should model what has been a bipartisan consensus: support for a robust US-Israel partnership and Israel's security for strategic and for moral reasons, standing up for Israel's legitimacy whenever it's challenged, and making sure that we remain committed to help Israel remain secure, Jewish, and democratic, and help Palestinians achieve the independence that they deserve through a two-state solution. That needs to be our North Star going forward, and we need to reject those, whether it's from the right or from the left, who see this through a very different prism, and who, again, are going to turn Israel into a political football that's not in anyone's interest.
Thanks, Tony. Here's a question from Rabbi Schwartzman, back to the peace process. What would the Biden administration do to convince the Palestinians to come and negotiate a two-state solution?
You're right that, of course, it takes two to tango. And one of the things that's gotten lost in the concerns, the rightful concerns, I think, that we have about some of the steps that Israel has taken or is contemplating taking that make two states less likely, are some of the choices that Palestinian leadership has taken that has done the same thing. There were, as you all know very well, offers on the table in the past, including under Olmert and Barak, that would have given Palestinians 95% or more of what they sought in the West Bank, among other things. So in the category of never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, I think a reminder to Palestinians that, and particularly the Palestinian people, that they can and should do better and deserve better. And that requires leadership. Leadership to make clear, again, the right and reality of a Jewish state. Leadership to make clear the need to end incitement, to end violence. Leadership to bring people along for the prospect of negotiating. And negotiating, of course, requires compromise. All of that is something that I think a Biden administration would strongly urge and remind the Palestinians of. But at the end of the day, to be realistic, the environment on both sides is so challenging and so difficult now that in the first instance, I think any administration would have to start by getting both sides to stop first any steps that make the prospect of getting back to a two-state negotiation process more difficult. And so the first thing is first do no harm. And then once that's established, start incrementally to take some steps that can rebuild and reboost some confidence, again, on both sides, that there is a way forward and there is a legitimate prospect for two states. This would be a very challenging, long, laborious process. And I wouldn't minimize in any way the prospects for success. But the alternative in terms of what's good for Israel, what's good for the Palestinians, and what's good for the United States, I think suggests that we have to make that effort.
Okay. Here's a question from Mark Rubin. The Israelis have a robust trade relations with China, which has become a major trading partner with Israel. The current administration has put increasing pressure on Israel to curtail these relations, especially where they impinge on U.S. national security interests. How will Biden administration approach those relations with China, and in particular, Israel's various economic relationships with China?
So this is a really interesting question and a very important one at the same time. I referenced earlier something that I think is really important, and let me just draw it out for a second. If you're looking at the way the world is dividing up now, one of the most profound divisions is between what you might call techno-democracies and techno-autocracies. And there is a fight on to determine who will dominate the technologies of the future. Not even the technologies of the future, the technologies of the present that are already having a profound impact on our lives. Whether it's 5G, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's any number of things that you can name. And what's so vital is figuring out who is going to, in effect, write the rules and establish the norms for the way those technologies are used, and whose values are going to be infused into the technologies, into the rules, into the norms, to make sure that the things we value and we believe in carry the day. I think the United States and Israel need to be working very, very closely together with other democracies in helping to carry that fight forward. And that requires looking at some of these very hard questions and very hard cases where we may have differences in approach. But there again, I think that's something that would be very much at the top of the agenda of a Biden administration, and done in a way that I think hopefully brings Israel along and strengthens our collaboration in thinking about how these technologies are defined going forward, how they're used going forward, and what we have to watch out for together.
Thanks, Tony. We talked a little bit about Iran before, but I have another question about Iran and UN from Ron Bacalars. What would Vice President Biden's position be regarding extending the UN sanctions on Iran regarding weapons?
So, as you know, in the course of negotiating the Iran nuclear deal, we actually got an extension of the arms embargo for a number of years, and it's now expiring. In a significant bit of irony, the administration is trying to use the so-called snapback provisions in the Iran nuclear deal to, in effect, force an extension of that embargo. Well, unfortunately, under the very terms of the agreement, in order to use the mechanisms in the agreement, you have to be a participant in the agreement. And the very White House statement that ended the United States adherence to the agreement, I think was headlined, this is the statement put out by the White House, the United States ending its participation in the Iran nuclear agreement. So you can't, unfortunately, have it both ways. Having pulled out of its participation, as it's no longer a participant in the agreement, we can't trigger the very mechanisms that were put in place to try to guard against Iran cheating, for example, or not fulfilling its obligations. So we'll see where that goes, but it seems to be on very, very shaky ground. Again, here's where, having alienated ourselves from our allies, it's much harder to build a consensus to deal with the other problems posed by Iran, including on arms. Having said that, there are other things that are still in place beyond the UN arms embargo that are in effect embargoes on arms to and from Iran, including in the context of the war in Yemen, including in the context of Syria, et cetera. All of those are on the books and can be enforced. But we're much more likely to get them enforced if we are in a good relationship with our allies and partners, not alienated from them as this administration has done.
I have another question here, Tony, from related to the UN, and it's from Facebook Live. Will the Biden administration somehow get the UN to stop Israel bashing and reveal the reality of how lightly the UN is on countries who are bad? I'll leave it there.
So, will we get it to stop? No, I don't think that's possible. Will we stand up forcefully against it and try to prevent it, diffuse it, and defeat it? Absolutely. And part of what's required to do that is to actually show up. The wholesale retreat of the United States under the Trump administration from all of these institutions and arrangements has put us in a much weaker position to stand up for and defend Israel when it's under attack. If you're not there, you can't do it. And the fact of the matter is, we used our voice, we used our vote, we used our influence, we used our leadership in these organizations and institutions to stand up for Israel when it was under attack. Sometimes we were the only ones doing it, but we did it, and it made a difference. When you're not there, you can't do it. So showing up is at least part of the battle. We would show up.
Thanks, Tony. I'm going to end with one final question, and then I'll give it back to Mark. And this question is from our board co-chair, Todd Richmond. There was a lot of talk on the campaign trail within the Democratic Party about conditioning foreign aid to Israel. As you noted, the Obama-Biden administration promised the largest foreign aid package in its history to Israel. I think this is a dangerous proposal by some members of our party. It's for security. It ends up making full-scale war less likely. I think this proposal will be bad for both Israel and America's security. What are the VP's views on this?
It's pretty simple. He's spoken to it directly. He is resolutely opposed to it. He would not tie military assistance to Israel to any political decisions that it makes, period, full stop. He said it, he's committed to it, and that would be the policy of the Biden administration.
Thank you, Tony. We're grateful for your time, especially during the circumstances. I'm going to toss it back over to Mark.
Again, let me just add my thanks, Tony, to you for just a tremendous tour de force review of U.S.-Israel relations across a whole range of issues. And again, we're grateful and delighted, and thank you also for the, the kind message from the Vice President. As you all on the call know, Democratic Majority for Israel is working every day to make sure that the Democratic Party remains the pro-Israel party it has been and remains the pro-Israel party it will be under Joe Biden. If you want to follow us, get more information, the tile that's up on the board now tells you how to do that. Sign up for on our website, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, etc. We look forward to future calls on topics that are of interest. We'll keep you informed of those. And again, tremendous number of actions that we're undertaking at DMFI to make sure that Democratic Party remains pro-Israel. We need your continued support to be able to continue that work, and we look forward to working with you and with Tony on an ongoing basis toward that goal. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful, safe afternoon and week.
Thank you all so much. Mark, Rachel, thank you. Thanks to all of you. Great to be with you.
Bye-bye.